So today we're going to talk about two main things that kind of relate to each other. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to make a French press coffee. It's pretty straightforward, but there are a lot of key things to make, say, like the best possible cup that you can make from a French press. And the second we'll talk about is how to store your beans, what do and do not for them. Let's get started. So the first thing we'll talk about is obviously the beans that you're going to want. French press can be used with any type of beans. It doesn't matter. I mean, obviously, a darker roast can be used in it, and a light roast can be used in it. What you're going to get out of a French press is a stronger cup of coffee because of the method that it uses to extract, and it leaves behind a lot of oils. Normally, if you're using a filter, either a paper filter or some kind of other mesh filter, that's removing them to give you a smoother cup of coffee. After that, once you get ready to then grind your beans, I highly recommend using a Burr Grinder because it can give you the most consistent grind. And I have a video about the difference between a Burr Grinder and a spice grinder, which I'll link down below. But for that, what you want to do is you want to grind it on the coarsest setting possible. So if it's out of, say, 9, so 1 is the finest, 9 is the coarsest, grind in the coarsest setting. And that's because you want to have as much surface area as possible with the water when you're going to extract all the flavor and the oils out of the coffee beans. So next is the water. The water should be pretty straightforward. You want to use just filtered water. This can be RO water. If you have a filter that goes on your tap, just use that. You want clean water because anything else can kind of give some off flavors. When you're ready to make your coffee, you want to grind it immediately before you're going to use it because ground coffee, once it's exposed to air, only has about 24-hour shelf life. And so if you're grinding it the night beforehand, you're losing some of that peak freshness as it goes overnight. So if you can just grind it right before it, that's what I recommend. That would give you the best flavors possible. Then for water temp. So when it comes to heating up your water, I use an electric kettle. I think that's the easiest. You just press a button, it'll heat it up. But what I do is I monitor the temperature as it's going because you want to hit about 178 to 182, somewhere in there. So ideally 180 is the temperature you should be aiming for. And that's because it's hot enough to extract all of the compounds out of the coffee, but it removes some of the astringency and bitterness that can come out of higher temperatures. If you're out of boiling, that's where it can come from if you have ever tasted kind of burnt or astringent coffee. What I would do if you have a thermometer is just monitor the temperature, and as you get closer and closer and closer, once it hits 180, shut it off and then pour it. Internally, if you need to boil it, that's fine. Once you hit it, boiling should be between about 212, depending on where your elevation is in Fahrenheit. Just let it cool back down to 180 and then add that to your coffee. Next, you're going to pour your coffee over the grounds that are inside the French press. So this is a single serving French press that I have. I like it, so it serves 12 total ounces. It serves 12 total ounces of coffee. And for that, what you want to do is you want to pour the water over top of the beans in kind of a swirling motion to kind of maximize the wetness of the beans for that. Once you fill up all the way, so I recommend for the amount of coffee to water, I recommend about 20 grams of coffee to about 300 milliliters of water, or which is about, for this one, is about 10 ounces of water. Once you add that to that, then you're going to steep it. So you fill the water up. You want to then, you can do a blooming method, and this kind of releases some of the CO2 as it bubbles out of the beans. And then you kind of, as I said, you swirl the hot water over it. And then finally, you'll take a spoon and stir the coffee because you want to get it as exposed to the water as possible, because what you see is coffee is less dense than water, so it sits on the top layer. The other thing I like to do is I like to push down the plunger so that the beans sit just below the water level, forcing them to be in contact with the water, and you'll have a little kind of oily layer on top. That's totally fine. Then the next is the time. So you want to let it steep for about 5 minutes total. So set a timer, use your smartphone, use a microwave, whatever you have available for you. And then once it turns off, then you just push down the plunger, and you're ready to pour and drink your coffee. For peak freshness, it's really recommended that you drink your coffee within 30 minutes of brewing, as otherwise it will start to lose some of that flavor. So if you've ever been to a coffee shop and you've noticed that it's kind of burnt or not as fresh tasting, that's because it's probably been sitting longer than that point. And a good coffee shop, after 30 minutes, will dump out the coffee and brew you a new batch, or they'll brew you a batch of coffee fresh such as a pour over. That's why they're so popular, is because they can pour you a single French press. The other benefit of French press is that because it does get all those oils, it can be really used for coffee pairings. So if you have a coffee that you want to pair with, say, a chocolate or a croissant or something like that, you can find a description on the coffee beans itself and see how that pairs with those things. And so for pairing, right, it's A plus B equals a C type of thing. So like I always think of the classic example from when I worked at Starbucks that was lemon loaf plus some African coffee, so say like Ethiopian coffee. When you had those two together and you paired them, it tastes like Fruit Loops. Now this is a new flavor that wasn't there in the coffee and wasn't there in the pastry, but that's kind of an example of that. The tips for making sure that you have the freshest type of coffee and the freshest, most flavorful cup that you can have. The first one is to make sure that you have a coffee that's not expired. So if you just flip on the bag somewhere, it'll have the expiration date. It'll say on the sell by date. So make sure that it's before that. You should get it be sealed. I do highly recommend that you get whole bean because an open bag of whole bean coffee will stay good for about 7 days, especially if it's sealed. So like if it's sealed in a jar like this. I also recommend putting it in a jar or something like this. So a mason jar, or this kind of flip top lid works great for keeping it away from air. So yeah, you want to keep because if you buy ground coffee, that'll expire or go bad after about 24 hours for peak freshness. Now the coffee isn't bad; it's just not as flavorful as when you first open the bag. The other thing, as I said, is that you want to keep it in an airtight container, but where you store this is important. So you do not want to store this next to a heat or somewhere extremely cold. So in the wintertime, don't store it in an outdoor window where it can get sunlight. You want to store it somewhere that's cool and dark. So like a pantry works really well. Same with a cabinet, that's cool and well, but you don't want it to be next to a heat source either. So like don't put it on top of your stove. If you have a toaster oven, don't put it above the toaster oven. And the biggest thing I'll ever say is never store your coffee inside a freezer. Coffee is extremely temperature sensitive, and if you have that rapid heating and cooling, which would be from when you take it out of the freezer and put it back into the freezer, or take it out of the freezer and then make a cup of coffee, now you're going from, say, like freezing temperature to boiling temperature, and that will shock the coffee and it will lose a lot of its freshness. If it's done that over and over and over again, the peak freshness will be gone. Also, don't store in the fridge. It's the same thing. It's just not as dramatic, but a freezer, you see a lot of people, you go into a house, you open up the freezer, and you'll see a bag of coffee that's ground. That's not going to be fresh ever. You can still drink it, but it's not going to be great. All right, so that's it. Those are kind of my quick tips, as well as how to make a good French press. Let me know what kind of coffee you like to drink down below. If you're new to the channel, please subscribe and give this video a like. We'll see you in the next one. Have a good one.